In 1953, 22 million New Yorkers voted for Miss Rheingold. That is not a metaphor. 22 million ballots were cast in a single year for a beer company's marketing contest. More votes than any gubernatorial election in New York State had ever recorded at that time. 35,000 voting boxes occupied supermarket aisles, bar tops, and crates of Rheingold beer across the metropolitan area. The company itself claimed the selection of Miss Rheingold had become almost as highly anticipated as the race for the White House. The campaign cost $8 million per year. Adjusted for today's purchasing power, that is approximately $60 million annually. For a beer brand marketing contest. Behind those numbers was a brewery that produced 4,236,000 barrels of beer in 1965. That was peak production. 100 years earlier, in the company's first year of operation, the output was 1,200 barrels. The distance between 1,200 and 4,236,000 is the distance between Samuel Liebmann's first rented brewery on Meserole Street in Brooklyn in 1854 and the largest brewing complex in the eastern United States, occupying 18 acres and 4 city blocks, described in 1907 as the most complete facility of its kind in the country. Then the number that ended everything: 0. The number of barrels produced at the Bushwick plant after January 15, 1976. The brewery that had employed more workers than most New York City institutions, that had commanded 35% of the New York State beer market at its peak, that had survived Prohibition and 2 world wars and the death of a city's entire brewing identity, closed its doors on a January morning and never opened them again. The building was torn down in 1981. An apartment complex now occupies the site at 10 Monteith Street in Bushwick, Brooklyn. It is called the Rheingold, the rise of a German Jewish family who fled political persecution and built an empire in Brooklyn. The peak that made their beer New York's drink. The fall that happened not in a crisis, but in a number. The number of dollars per barrel that Anheuser-Busch could produce for that New York could not. Welcome inside the brewery where New York got its beer, and where the math eventually won. 1854. The Philadelphia waterfront, then Brooklyn. The number that begins the Liebmann story is 1854, the year Samuel Liebmann, his wife, and 5 of their 6 children arrived at the Philadelphia wharf aboard a ship from Germany. The 6th child, Joseph, the oldest son, had arrived 4 years earlier in 1850, sent ahead by his father to find a suitable location for a brewery. The instructions were precise. They were a brewing family, they needed water, they needed a German community, and they needed distance from the political instability that had cost them everything in Württemberg. Samuel Liebmann was born on November 12, 1799 in Aufhausen, a village in what is now Baden-Württemberg. He was the son of a merchant and religious instructor. In 1840, he moved to Ludwigsburg and purchased the inn and brewery called Zum Stern, to the Star, on Seestrasse. The inn became a gathering place for free thinkers, liberals, and revolutionaries in the years of political ferment that preceded the German Revolution of 1848. Samuel was a supporter of Republican ideals, a man whose customer base included soldiers and reformers who met at his tables to discuss the ideas that the Württemberg government found dangerous. When the revolution failed and the government turned on those who had supported it, Zum Stern was effectively banned. The soldiers who had been its regulars were forbidden to enter. The family's business model was destroyed by political circumstance. Samuel made the decision to leave. And Joseph Liebmann met his family on the wharf in Philadelphia on November 7, 1854, and escorted them to Brooklyn. Within a week of arrival, Samuel Liebmann had leased a small brewery on Meserole Street in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Within a year, with a speed that suggests both urgency and absolute clarity of purpose, The family had purchased a 6.4-acre site at the corner of Forest Street and Bremen Street in the Bushwick section of Brooklyn and built a new plant. Production in the first year, 1,200 barrels. By 1877, 39,000 barrels. By 1894, 165,000 barrels. By 1900, 200,000 barrels per year. By 1914, 700,000 barrels. Each of those numbers represents not just growth but compounding infrastructure. The buildings that had to be constructed to house each new level of production, the refrigeration systems that Liebmann's pioneered, and that made the Brooklyn plant the first in the eastern United States to have its own laboratory. The adjacent properties absorbed as the plant expanded. The Schönwald Brewery acquired in 1878, the Klaus Lipsius Brewery acquired in 1902. Samuel retired in 1868 and died in 1872. His three sons, Joseph, Henry, and Charles, divided the responsibilities with institutional precision. Joseph handled finances. Henry handled brewing. Charles handled management and operations. They rotated the chief executive role among themselves annually. In 1903, the brothers retired and handed the business to 6 of their sons. The Liebmann Brewery was not just a family enterprise, it was a family government, a dynasty with succession protocols and distributed responsibilities that had produced one of the largest brewing operations in the country from an original investment of 1,200 barrels. The name Rheingold had not yet arrived. That came in 1883, and when it came, it changed everything about how the brewery would be remembered. 1883, Bushwick, Brooklyn. The precise circumstances of how the Rheingold name was chosen remain a matter of documented ambiguity. 3 distinct versions survive in the historical record, each plausible, each consistent with the cultural milieu of a prosperous German-Jewish brewing family in 1883 Brooklyn. The first version, the name was simply an allusion to the great Rhine River in Germany, which flows through the regions the Liebmanns had left behind, and the word gold attached naturally to a lager with a golden color. The second version, at a banquet held after a performance of Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle at the Metropolitan Opera, a conductor, taken with the appearance of the Liebmann beer, held up his glass and declared it the color of Das Rheingold, the first opera of the 4-part cycle and a work whose subject was the mythological gold of the Rhine River. The third version, a special beer was brewed specifically for a dinner honoring the head of the Metropolitan Opera, following the season's final performance of Das Rheingold in 1883. The beer was named for the occasion. Why it was such a hit that the brewery introduced it as a permanent product. What is certain, the Rheingold brand name first appeared in documentation no later than the 1890s, and a reference from a World's Columbian Exposition catalog in 1893 confirms it was already established by then. What is equally certain is that the name proved to be one of the most durable brand names in American beer history, surviving more ownership changes, more corporate reorganizations, more decades of dormancy and revival than almost any beer brand in the country. The name was not the business. The business was the Liebmann family's operation, but the name would outlast the family's control of it, outlast the building in Brooklyn, outlast the brewery itself, and continue drifting through American beer culture in attenuated form for more than a century after the original plant first used it. In 1907, the Liebmann plant was formally described as the largest and most complete brewing facility in the eastern United States, occupying 18 acres and 4 city blocks. By this point, the operation had absorbed multiple neighboring plants, pioneered new refrigeration methods, and built its own laboratory, a technological capability that most breweries in the country had not yet developed. The number that should have worried everyone. In 1914, Liebmann's produced 700,000 barrels. 2 years later, The First World War introduced something that had nothing to do with barrels. It introduced the mathematics of anti-German sentiment in a country that was preparing to fight Germany's government. And the Liebmann Brewery, with its German name, its German immigrant founding family, its German language brand associations, suddenly existed in an environment that would transform into outright prohibition of its product within 6 years. The brewery survived it all. But the survival was not free. 1920 to 1933, Bushwick, Brooklyn, and Munich, Germany. The number that defined the American brewing industry from 1920 through 1933 was 0. The legally permitted alcohol content of any product manufactured or sold as beer in the United States under the Volstead Act and the 18th Amendment. More than 1,000 American breweries closed during those 13 years. The Liebmann operation survived. The survival mechanism was standard for the era: near beer, whose alcohol content was reduced to the legal limit of 0.5%, lemonade, and Teutonic, a concentrated liquid extract of malt and hops marketed for nutrition and health, originally developed in the 1890s as a supposedly medicinal product. The brewery also sold NAB, a cereal beverage described in advertisements as a new beverage made from the choicest products of the farm. The men who had produced 700,000 barrels of lager in 1914 were now producing malt extract and lemonade. The ledger of the Prohibition years was not just financial, it was institutional. The relationships between the brewery and its distribution network, between the brand and its consumer base, between the physical plant and its skilled workers, all of these frayed during 13 years of legal near prohibition. When the 18th Amendment was repealed in 1933 and the industry was theoretically restored, what companies discovered was that restoration was not automatic. The market that had existed in 1919 did not simply resume in 1933. What Liebmann's had that most competitors did not was a connection to Europe that arrived not as a package, but as a person. Dr. Hermann Schulein was the general manager of Löwenbräu, the world-renowned Munich brewery, one of the great lager operations of the 20th century. His father, Josef Schulein, had acquired 2 of Munich's leading breweries at the end of the 19th century, and Hermann had managed the 1920 merger that created the modern Löwenbräu. He carried the most advanced European brewing knowledge available outside Germany in his professional memory. He also carried a necessity that had nothing to do with brewing. By 1933, the anti-Semitic policies of Adolf Hitler's government were making Jewish professional life in Germany increasingly untenable. The Schuleins were Jewish. Hermann Schulein left Germany and arrived in New York, where the Liebmann family, themselves a German Jewish dynasty, recruited him. Working alongside Philipp Liebmann, the great-grandson of founder Samuel, Schulein developed the recipe that would define the brand for the next 3 decades: Rheingold Extra Dry, a lager with European character, crisper and drier than the American mainstream beers that were reassembling themselves after Prohibition, positioned as a premium product for New York's most discerning beer drinkers. The year Schulein's recipe met Philipp Liebmann's marketing instinct, 1940. The result of that meeting was not a product. It was a phenomenon. But here is what the ledgers of 1940 were already beginning to show to anyone reading the right numbers. The large Midwestern breweries, Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, Schlitz in Milwaukee, Miller in Milwaukee, had survived Prohibition through the same near-beer mechanisms. And they had spent 13 years building something that Liebmann's had not. They had built national distribution infrastructure. They were preparing to go everywhere. Liebmann's was preparing to own New York. Both strategies worked for a while. 1940 to 1964, New York City. In 1939, a printing salesman named Bob Wexler called on Philipp Liebmann to present a new printing process for the brewery's point-of-purchase materials. Among the samples Wexler brought were photographs of a Chilean-born actress, model, and tennis player named Jinx Falkenberg. Philip Liebmann looked at the photographs, put aside the printing samples, and made a decision. Jinx Falkenberg would be Miss Rheingold 1940. The campaign cost that first year is not precisely recorded. What is recorded is what happened to Rheingold's market position in the months that followed. The brand moved from 6th place in the New York metropolitan area beer market to first. Number 1. In 1 year, Philip Liebmann extended the logic of what had worked. From 1941 onward, the selection of Miss Rheingold was open to public vote. Dealers chose from brewery-selected candidates in 1941. From 1942 through 1964, the winner was chosen by consumers casting ballots at voting boxes displayed in bars, supermarkets, and retail locations across the metropolitan area. The scale the contest reached is best understood through specific numbers. At peak, 35,000 voting boxes deployed. In 1953 alone, 22 million votes cast. In 1959, over 22 million. Campaign cost at peak, $8 million annually, the equivalent of approximately $60 million in current purchasing power. Then the company's own marketing claim, the selection of Miss Rheingold was almost as highly anticipated as the race for the White House. The campaign elevated Rheingold to a market share of 35% of New York State beer consumption during the 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s. No other beer brand in the state's history had achieved or would again achieve that number in a market as large and competitive as New York. The advertising extended beyond the contest. Rheingold sponsored the New York Mets as the team's official beer. When Nat King Cole became the first major black entertainer to host a national television show, and most advertisers refused to sponsor the program, Rheingold became its New York regional sponsor. The brewery featured African-American, Puerto Rican, and Asian American actors in its commercials as early as 1965, a practice with no parallel among the major New York brands of the era. Jackie Robinson appeared in Rheingold advertisements. Sarah Vaughan, John Wayne, the Marx Brothers, Gene Shepard, the radio personality, was the Mets broadcast spokesman. Meanwhile, in a building at Bushwick and Forest Streets, something that would matter far more than any of this was taking place. A biochemist named Dr. Joseph O. Wads was working in the Liebmann laboratory on a problem that no one had yet solved commercially: how to make a beer with significantly fewer calories without destroying its flavor. The result of his work became Gablinger's Diet Beer, introduced in 1966. It flopped. The name was awkward. The advertising was tone-deaf. One commercial showed an overweight man eating spaghetti while holding a Gablinger's. Owades himself remembered, "Not only did no one want to try the beer, they couldn't even stand to look at this guy." The formula for Gablinger's passed to Meister Brau. Meister Brau passed it to Miller. Miller reformulated it, spent $25 million marketing it with professional athletes under the Tastes Great Less Filling campaign, and launched Miller Lite nationally in 1975. Miller Lite became the most successful new product in the history of the American beer industry, taking light beer from a negligible fraction of the market to 44% of all American beer consumption by 2002. The company that invented light beer sold 35% of New York's beer. The company that sold Miller Lite sold 20% of all American beer. Those two numbers summarize what happened to Rheingold in one arithmetic comparison. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into the history of the companies that built and unmade American cities. 1960 to 1964. Bushwick, Brooklyn, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The number that could not be argued with was the cost per barrel. By the early 1960s, Anheuser-Busch, Miller, and Coors could produce a barrel of beer for under $1.50. Their national distribution networks, their economies of scale, or their automated plants in cities where labor and land costs were a fraction of New York City's. All of it combined to give them a cost structure that a Brooklyn brewery occupying 18 acres of expensive urban real estate simply could not match. Liebmann's cost per barrel was significantly higher. Estimates from the era put the gap at multiple dollars per barrel, enough that at the volumes being sold, the competitive disadvantage was measured not in margin points, but in millions of dollars annually. The Liebmann Brewery had expanded through the 1940s and 1950s with an acquisitive confidence that the market position seemed to justify. In 1947, they acquired the Eichler Brewery in the Bronx. In 1950, they acquired the Traumer's Brewery in Orange, New Jersey. In 1954, they acquired the San Francisco and Los Angeles plants of Acme Brewing Company, moving into California with the 5-plant infrastructure that made them the second-largest multi-plant brewing company in the country, behind only Falstaff, with 6 plants. The California expansion failed. The San Francisco plant was closed in 1955. The Los Angeles plant was sold to Hamm's Brewery in 1957. The attempt to become a national brewery, to fight Anheuser-Busch and Miller on their own terms, on their own ground, did not work. The Liebmann operation pulled back to New York and New Jersey, and the numbers that mattered were the ones that couldn't be fixed by acquiring another brewery in a city where labor contracts negotiated with the Brewery Workers Union established wage scales well above what Midwestern competitors paid, where real estate costs per square foot were multiples of what the same square footage would cost in St. Louis or Milwaukee, and where the sheer density of the urban production environment made the automated efficiency of purpose-built suburban plants impossible to replicate in an 18-acre Bushwick complex. The cost structure was not a temporary disadvantage. It was structural and permanent. Philip Liebmann and the 4th American generation of the family looked at the numbers in 1963 and 1964 and made the decision that the numbers demanded. In 1964, and they sold the company to Pepsi-Cola United Bottlers Inc., a New Jersey-based bottling and distribution company, for $26 million. The price of 120 years of brewing history, 4 American generations of Liebmann management, 35% of the New York State beer market, $26 million. Beer sales under the new ownership peaked the following year, 1965, at 4,236,000 barrels. Then they declined. 1964 to 1977. Brooklyn, the East River, and Philadelphia. The sequence of transactions that followed the Liebmann family's sale of the brewery in 1964 can be read as a series of numbers, and those numbers tell the story more efficiently than any narrative could. Cheers 1964, Pepsi-Cola United Bottlers acquires Liebmann's for $26 million, takes the name Rheingold Breweries for the combined entity. 1965, peak production, 4,236,000 barrels. Market share beginning to erode. 1966, Gablinger's diet beer introduced, fails commercially. Formula eventually licensed to Meister Brau. 1967, Dawson Brewing Company of New Bedford, Massachusetts acquired. Rheingold now operates plants in Brooklyn, Orange, New Jersey, and New Bedford. February 1973, PepsiCo Inc., the parent company, buys a controlling interest in Rheingold Breweries, paying $57 million for 83% of the combined Rheingold-Pepsi bottling operation. Industry observers note at the time that PepsiCo is far more interested in the company's soft drink bottling operations in California, Florida, Mexico, and Puerto Rico than in the beer division. 1973. Rheingold beer sales fall below 3 million barrels for the first time since the mid-1950s. January 1974. After difficult negotiations with Teamsters union locals, PepsiCo closes the Brooklyn plant. The stated reason? The plant is on track to lose $8 million due to high labor and operating costs. The event that follows is one of the most vivid moments in the history of New York brewing. Pepsi pours 100,000 gallons of beer into the East River, not into storage, not into alternative distribution, into the river. The company's explanation is that packing the product for distribution would cost more than its value. The Teamsters union locals representing the Brooklyn plant workers file an antitrust lawsuit seeking $600 million in treble damages and an injunction preventing the closure. The plant is kept open for an additional 2 months while the lawsuit works through the courts. In early March, the plant is officially closed. March 8, 1974, William Black, founder of the Chock-full o' Nuts Coffee Company, purchases the brewery for $1 plus assumption of its $10 million in outstanding debt. The union accepts a deal giving workers 10% ownership of the brewery in exchange for wage concessions. The math on that transaction, $1 plus $10 million in debt. That is what the brewery that produced 4,236,000 barrels of beer in 1965 was worth on March 8, 1974. The Brooklyn plant operated unprofitably for 2 more years. Mid-January 1976, Brooklyn brewing operations end permanently. The Schaefer Brewery announces its own Brooklyn closure within days of Rheingold's. On January 1, 1976, 2 breweries employing nearly 2,000 people had been producing nearly 40% of all beer served in New York City. By the end of January, neither one was operational. On March 29, 1976, the last barrel of beer was brewed in New York City by the old guard of breweries. October 1977, Chock-full o' Nuts sells Rheingold Breweries to Christian Schmidt Brewing Company of Philadelphia. Production moves to Schmidt's Philadelphia and Cleveland plants. The Orange, New Jersey plant is sold. The brewery that was built in Bushwick, Brooklyn, is now producing its beer in Pennsylvania and Ohio. 1981, the Bushwick Brewery building is torn down. 1966 to 1975, Brooklyn, Chicago, and Milwaukee. The number that quantifies what Rheingold gave away is 44%. That is the share of the American beer market accounted for by light beer by 2002. A category that did not commercially exist before a biochemist named Dr. Joseph Owadz worked in the Liebmann laboratory in the mid-1960s. Owadz, who had studied fermentation science at Fleischmann's Yeast before joining Rheingold, was attempting to solve a consumer problem that he identified precisely. It was a common belief then that drinking beer made you fat, he said years later. People weren't jogging, and everybody believed beer drinkers got a big, fat beer belly. I couldn't do anything about the taste of beer, but I could do something about the calories. His solution was biochemical. He discovered that an enzyme called amyloglucosidase could convert the unfermented starch that remained in finished beer, the starch that contributed to caloric content without fermentable sugar value, into fermentable sugar. By adding this enzyme to the brewing process, the yeast consumed more starch, producing a beer with dramatically reduced calories and carbohydrates while maintaining a recognizable lager character. Rheingold introduced the product in 1966 as Gablinger's Diet Beer, named for Dr. Hirsch Gablinger, the Swiss chemist whose patent had first described the amyloglucosidase process. The marketing was catastrophically wrong for its moment. The name Diet Beer combined 2 words, diet and beer, that 1960s American masculinity did not combine willingly. One advertisement featured an obese man eating spaghetti while holding the product. Owadz remembered, "Not only did no one want to try the beer, They couldn't even stand to look at this guy. With his supervisor's permission, Owades shared the formula with a friend at the Chicago-based Meister Brau Brewery, which launched it as Meister Brau Light in 1967. Meister Brau went bankrupt in 1972. Miller Brewing Company purchased 3 of Meister Brau's brands in that bankruptcy, including Meister Brau Light. Miller spent the following 3 years reformulating and remarketing the beer. The formula was tweaked. The name became Light Beer from Miller, and later Miller Lite. The advertising was built around masculine credibility rather than dietary anxiety. Professional athletes, tastes great, less filling, campaigns that made drinking a low-calorie beer something a man could do without embarrassment. Miller Lite launched nationally in February 1975. In its first year, production totals reached 12.8 million barrels. It became the most popular new product in the history of the American beer industry. As one industry historian recorded, by 2002, light beer was 44% of all beer consumed in the United States. Every can of Bud Light, every bottle of Coors Light, every light beer produced by every brewery in the country traces its commercial lineage to the Liebmann laboratory in Bushwick, Brooklyn, where Joseph Owades worked in the 1960s. Rheingold did not profit from this. The formula had been shared, not sold. By the time the light beer category was generating billions of dollars annually, the brewery that had originated the formula was producing its beer in Pennsylvania under an ownership that had bought the brand from a coffee company. 1998 to 2013, Utica, New York, and Brooklyn. The number was 20 years. 20 years elapsed between the effective end of Rheingold as a commercially significant beer brand in the New York market. Around 1978, when the last bottle was sold in the metropolitan area, and the attempt to bring it back in 1998, Mike Mataro, a veteran beer industry executive, Skira and Biermachines, licensed the Rheingold brand from Stroh Brewery Company in 1996 and launched Rheingold Brewing Company, Inc. The team he assembled included Walter Terry Liebmann, a fifth-generation American member of the founding family, who had worked at Rheingold breweries in the 1960s. Terry Liebmann served as the company's historian and living link to the brand's heritage. The old brewmaster Joseph Owades, who had invented light beer at the Liebmann laboratory, was brought onto the board. Production was contracted to FX Matt Brewing Company in Utica, New York. The beer was not made in Brooklyn, not made by the Liebmanns, not made in any facility connected to the original operation, but it carried the name, the heritage, and the gold and black color scheme that New Yorkers who were old enough recognized immediately. The initial 1998 launch was modest and did not catch sufficient momentum. The real revival came in 2002 and 2003, when a branding agency called Powell of New York developed a guerrilla marketing campaign that reintroduced Rheingold to a New York demographic that had not been its customer base in the 1950s. The new Miss Rheingold contest was revived in 2003, but in a form that Philip Liebmann would not have recognized. The new contestants were New York City bartenders. According to a company spokesperson, they no longer wore ball gowns and white gloves. They had tattoos. They were pierced. They were badasses. The Village Voice named it the best marketing campaign co-opting hipster drinking habits of 2003. From 2004, some production moved to Greenpoint Beer Works in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn. Rheingold was physically being made in Brooklyn again, for the first time since January 15, 1976. The symbolism was not lost on the press coverage. The campaign attracted enough business to represent genuine recovery. By 2010, Rheingold was being sold in the New York metropolitan area, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. By 2011, distribution had extended to Cincinnati, Georgia, and Florida. The numbers were small compared to the original operation's 4 million barrels, but the brand was alive. It was being drunk, and it was generating revenue. In 2005, Drinks Americas of Wilton, Connecticut had purchased the Rheingold Brewing Company. By 2013, Drinks Americas stopped selling Rheingold. The beer disappeared from the market for another 10 years. 1981 to the present. Monteith Street, Bushwick, Brooklyn. The number on the address is 10. 10 Monteith Street, Bushwick, Brooklyn. That is where the apartment complex called the Rheingold now stands. Ductwein, on the land where the brewery once occupied 18 acres and 4 city blocks, and employed thousands of workers and produced 4 million barrels of beer in a single year. The brewery building was demolished in 1981. The demolition is documented in photographs held by the Library of Congress. The old brick walls of the complex coming down in sections, the largest brewing facility in the eastern United States being reduced to rubble to clear the land for uses not yet determined. For decades after the demolition, the site sat in various states of development and vacancy. In the early 2000s, affordable housing was built on part of the parcel, more than 300 units in a development championed by local city council members, with addresses including 535 Bushwick Avenue, E14 to 38 Monteith Street, and 16 to 38 Knoll Street. In 2018, a 500-unit apartment building was completed at 10 Monteith Street. The developers named it the Rheingold. This is not irony in the literary sense. It is something more straightforward. The name that Samuel Liebmann's family built over 120 years of brewing, the name that Philip Liebmann's marketing made into a cultural institution, the name that survived Prohibition and 2 world wars, and the death of an entire city's brewing industry, the name that Joseph Owades attached to the first light beer ever produced. That name now appears on the facade of a residential building in Bushwick, Brooklyn, used as a marketing asset for apartment rentals. The number of Liebmann family members still involved in any aspect of the name's current use: 0. The family sold in 1964. The building was torn down in 1981. The brand passed through Pepsi, Chock-full o' Nuts, Christian Schmidt, G. Heilemann, Stroh, Pabst, and Drinks Americas before returning to periodic commercial availability under contract brewing arrangements. During the cleanup of the World Trade Center after September 11, 2001, workers discovered Rheingold beer cans that had been stashed in the beams of the towers during construction decades earlier. Construction workers in the 1960s and 1970s had tucked cans of Rheingold into the structural fabric of the buildings. A detail that says something precise about who Rheingold's core consumers were and how completely the brand had become part of their working lives. The cans were found buried in the beams of buildings that no longer existed by workers cleaning up an event that had destroyed them, 50 years after the beer that filled those cans had been made in a brewery that had also been torn down. 1950 to 1976. St. Louis, Milwaukee, and Brooklyn. The arithmetic that ended New York City's independent brewing industry has one primary variable: the cost of producing 1 barrel of beer in an urban brewery in the most expensive city in the United States versus the cost of producing 1 barrel in a purpose-built, automated, suburban facility in the American Midwest. Rheingold's production cost per barrel in the early 1970s was estimated by industry analysts at approximately $4 per barrel. Anheuser-Busch and Miller's cost per barrel, at the scale they were operating and in the locations they had chosen, was under $1.50. The gap, more than $2 per barrel, meant that on every barrel sold in New York, a local brewery was surrendering $2 in competitive disadvantage to the national brands. At 3 million barrels of annual production, that gap represents $6 million per year in structural disadvantage. Not from bad decisions, not from inferior beer, from geography and scale, and the economics of urban industrial production in a post-industrial city. The national brands compounded this structural advantage with marketing budgets that regional breweries could not match. Anheuser-Busch's national advertising spend in the 1970s dwarfed what Rheingold, Schaefer, and Ballantyne combined could afford in any given year. The Miss Rheingold contest, which had cost $8 million annually at its peak, $60 million in current dollars, was the most expensive regional beer marketing campaign in the country. It was not enough. Together, Rheingold, Ballantyne, Denine, and Schaefer had controlled roughly 60% of the New York metropolitan area beer market as recently as 1964. By 1976, all three were gone from New York production. The entire independent brewing tradition of a city that had housed 48 breweries in Brooklyn alone at the turn of the century, a city that had at various points produced 30% of the nation's beer, had been eliminated not by any failure of product quality, but by the arithmetic of national scale. The number that remained in New York after the closing of Rheingold and Schaefer in January 1976 was zero. 0 independent breweries in a city of 8 million. The brewing industry that had sustained entire neighborhoods, employed thousands of workers, and built the fortunes of German immigrant families across 3 and 4 generations had been consolidated out of existence. 1940 to the present. The collective memory of New York. The test of a brand's depth is not its market share at peak. It is what survives after the market share is gone. My beer is Rheingold, the dry beer. Think of Rheingold whenever you buy beer. It's not bitter, not sweet. It's the dry flavored treat. Won't you try extra dry Rheingold beer? The jingle, set to Emil Waldteufel's Estudiantina Waltz, Opus 191, was written by jazz musician Les Paul in 1951 and broadcast on radio and television throughout the New York metropolitan area for the following 2 decades. It was heard often enough. During the years when Rheingold commanded 35% of New York beer sales to embed itself in the neurological architecture of an entire generation. In a 1989 New York Times column on beer jingles, readers were still citing the Rheingold tune as the most memorable commercial music of their childhoods. In an episode of The Golden Girls, the characters, including Sophia, who recalled that Rheingold was her late husband Salvatore's favorite beer, spontaneously sang the jingle from memory. In Stephen King's 1974 novel Carrie, the rough character Billy Nolan drinks Rheingold rather than Budweiser, the detail working as instant shorthand for a specific kind of working-class New York identity. A 2003 New York Times piece described Rheingold's core consumer in language that its own marketing had helped create. A loyal cadre of working men who would just as soon have eaten nails as drink another beer maker's suds. Those working men are the ones who stashed Rheingold cans in the beams of the World Trade Center, the ones who voted 22 million times for Miss Rheingold in a single year, the ones who worked the floor of the Bushwick plant on the last day of operation, January 15, 1976, before the brewing equipment fell silent and did not start again. The brewery that produced 1,200 barrels in 1854. The brewery that produced 700,000 in 1914. The brewery that produced 4,236,000 in 1965. The brewery that produced 0 in 1976. The building is apartments now. The name is on the facade. The jingle is in memory. The math is done. Return to the opening number. In 1953, 22 million New Yorkers voted for Miss Rheingold. In current dollars, the campaign that produced those 22 million votes cost $60 million per year. What does 22 million votes equal in terms of the company's eventual fate? $26 million. That is what the brewery sold for in 1964, just 9 years after the peak of the contest's influence. $1 plus $10 million in debt. That is what it was worth on March 8, 1974, when Chock-full O' Nuts purchased it from PepsiCo. 0. That is the barrel count at the Bushwick plant after January 15th. 1976, 3 implicit lessons expressed as financial equations. First, 35% market share minus the cost structure of an urban brewery equals declining profitability, regardless of brand loyalty. Market share is not margin. It is not protection against structural cost disadvantage. The Liebmanns held 35% of New York State beer and still could not sustain the operation against the arithmetic of national scale. Second, the light beer formula, developed at Rheingold in 1966, which failed commercially as Gablinger's, generated 44% of the entire American beer market by 2002 under a different company's name. The invention was worth billions. The company that invented it received nothing. And because the path from innovation to commercial success required the marketing capability and scale that only Miller possessed at the moment the formula was ready. Third, the Miss Rheingold contest elevated Rheingold from 6th in the New York market to 1st in a single year and sustained that leadership for 25 years. When the contest ended in 1965, sales began a decline that eventually led to the brewery's closing in 1976, as the contest's own historical record acknowledges. The brand was the marketing. When the marketing stopped, the brand was not independently strong enough to sustain its position against the numbers that the national breweries were producing. The final image, the last balance sheet entry of the original S. Liebmann Brewery, which became Rheingold Breweries, which closed in January 1976. Assets, the name which still exists on an apartment building in Bushwick and on a contract brewed beer sold in 5 states. Liabilities, 122 years of history, 4 generations of family ownership, and the invention of the most commercially successful product innovation in the history of American brewing, given away for free. The number that remained in New York after the brewery closed? 0. The number of Liebmann family members currently involved in brewing under the name their great-great-grandfather carried from Ludwigsburg to Brooklyn? 0. The number of times the Rheingold jingle has stopped echoing in the memory of people who grew up in New York before 1976? Also, remarkably, 0.